It gives me great pleasure, and it's a great honor to welcome our next two speakers, Dr. Nicole Ofiesh and Kara Matejka. Very warm welcome to our Global Empathy Conference. It's wonderful to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to your session so much. Where the speakers are going to be sharing how prioritizing empathy and perspective shifting in our individual practices work and through brain, and they're going to talk to us about brain-based learning that empowers individuals to understand their unique learning profiles. I think that's really fascinating, and to overcome barriers and to build on their strengths. All of those words are really fascinating. Just to tell you a little bit about our speakers, Dr. Nicole Ofiesh is a cognitive behavioral scientist with expertise in the intersection of learning and adulthood. That's so fascinating, Nicole. Nicole applies this knowledge with an understanding of context and culture to explain how people learn as individuals. With a focus on the missing middle, the time between high school and retirement, she believes an understanding of how cognition and the brain is associated with learning and performance is critical to preparing people for the needs of the 21st and, very importantly, 22nd centuries. I haven't come across that before. The 22nd. So wonderful and so fascinating. And Kara Matejka is an educational therapist, professional who specializes in coaching post-secondary students and young adults who are experiencing academic, social, and emotional challenges, mainly due to ADHD and dyslexia. With widespread experience as a college counselor, college learning specialist and ESL teacher for business professionals. That's really interesting. And it sort of touches on what Robin's diversion into the court case showed us. Kara utilizes her background in international humanitarian studies to research how education can best be utilized to further the DEI goals and eliminate poverty. Wow, we cannot be more pleased, proud, and honored to have you both lead our next session and part of our conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for joining us for the Empathy Effect. We're excited for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm Kara Matejka, and my professional background is in teaching English as a second language, college counseling for high school students, and educational therapy. In my private practice, I specialize in executive functioning coaching for young adults who are gifted and neurodiverse, particularly with ADHD or dyslexia.
And I'm Nicole Ofiesh. I started in the field of special education about 30 years ago, working with children who were adolescents taken away from their families for abuse. Fast forward, after working with many individuals one-on-one and doing research in college teaching in the field of special education, it became really clear that we needed to focus on inclusion and bringing the brain into the center of the classroom, because teachers tend to teach to a student, a mythical average student. And as we understand that we need to include students who learn differently and interact differently, it became really important to think about what is their experience. So that led me to design thinking in education, because one of the steps in design thinking is empathy. And empathy has changed everything I've done, which, being in a field for so long, I can say that that's a big statement, but it has ended up really being one of the most important things I think we can do as individuals who work with others and want to create a more humanistic experience for them in the classroom. Kara and I are each going to talk a little bit about a case study that we have each experienced. And the goal in sharing this case of Anna is not necessarily to tell you about my educational therapy work with Anna, but to tell you what her experience was. Anna is an individual who is on the autism spectrum, and she eventually went to a private school because she was not getting the education she needed in a public school. She tended to get top grades in classes she enjoyed, but failing grades in everything else. So you can see if it was something she was very, very interested in, she could understand it, she wanted to understand it, and she could perform well. She had well above average IQ, and she published graphic novels all the time online with great success. But Anna consistently would get in trouble in school. She would have trouble reading the room. One good example is when she took her iPad out in the middle of English class after the teacher had repeatedly told everyone that they're not supposed to have their technology out. But she kept taking it out and she would work on her graphic novels. The teacher took her outside to talk to her about this. Later that day, she said to me, "The teacher took me outside today." I said, "What did she talk to you about?" "Well, she talked to me about using the iPad in the classroom." I said, "Oh, what do you think about that?" I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Do you think you were in trouble?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, what happened after that?" "Well, I had to go sit somewhere else, not in the classroom." I said, "Okay, you were in trouble." So this was pretty significant. She always had trouble reading the room, social dynamics, social cues. And eventually our conversation went something like, would it be helpful for you if we talked about other experiences and what other people might be thinking when they see this happen to you, or what you might be thinking when you see something happen to someone else that you don't understand? And all of a sudden, our work moved from working in academics to understand what we call the hidden curriculum, all those things that are happening that you may not be able to understand because you can't perspective shift to understand the teacher's expectations, the student's expectations, etc. And it changed everything. And I can honestly say more and more, especially during COVID, we would see students like Anna who needed an approach that was centered in empathy and perspective shifting and understanding what is your experience and what is that intersection between doing well in the classroom and in life and not.
Okay, I'm going to tell you about my client, Adam. He and I had monthly meetings for 2 years. I was his college counselor while he was in 11th and 12th grade, culminating in me helping him apply to top colleges across the United States. As you can tell from his academic profile, he was and is incredibly motivated and gifted. My meetings with Adam were on Zoom, kind of like ours today. And in one of our monthly meetings, Adam held his arm up to the camera and laughed that he was wearing a hospital bracelet. He told me that he had tried to take his own life a few days prior and had been released that morning from a 72-hour hold in the psychiatric hospital. I had no idea about any of this until that moment. In fact, our meeting that day had been scheduled to decide if he should take on an additional varsity sport to help make his already stacked academic profile even more competitive for when he was applying to these top colleges. The idea that he desperately needed help hadn't ever crossed my mind because I had only been thinking about his academic profile, never his social and emotional profile. At that moment, I had no training to deal with the emotion of academics. I felt painfully inadequate, and honestly, I was scared. It was obvious that the monthly meetings I had with Adam to ask him about his grades and how we could beef up his extracurricular activities meant nothing if I was not actively participating in his well-being. So this experience, or rather my lack of experience, catapulted me into searching for ways that I could formally educate myself on how to incorporate empathy as a practice, which is when I discovered educational therapy. Educational therapy offers an individualized approach to remediate challenges with learning, and it helps to build resilience. Because of this, it helps stimulate an individual's awareness of their own strengths so that they can use those strengths to their best advantage to overcome or compensate for areas of weakness. In essence, being trained as an educational therapist allows me to support the whole person, academically, emotionally, and socially. In my private practice, I begin my work with each client using comprehensive assessments. I personally use the BRIEF, which stands for the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, and the LASSI, which stands for Learning and Study Strategies Inventory. These really help me understand an individual's specific strengths and their weaknesses in executive functioning. Depending on the client's age, this initial assessment period may also involve looking at their standardized test scores and getting input from teachers, maybe their parents, and other allied professionals. Then, based on those assessment results, I develop a personalized intervention plan to address the individual's unique needs. This intervention plan might focus on teaching specific executive functioning strategies to improve their working memory or introducing problem-solving skills. I also address emotional and behavioral challenges that can impact their learning, such as challenges with their sleep schedule or irregularity with eating or low self-esteem. So once the specific intervention plan is determined, then the real work begins. My typical format for an educational therapy session centers on repetition and predictability. We know from neuroscience that this helps the brain to feel safe and ultimately makes it more receptive. I follow a structure of checking in on the individual's current mood. This is first because it matters most. If they haven't slept and their brain is buzzing because they have a Spanish test in 2 hours, then I want to know about that from the outset. From there, we typically talk about their ongoing goals or set a specific goal for our session. If the individual is feeling burned out, they might tell me they've been putting off their homework for the past week because they've been too stressed about their Spanish test. So then we might look at the homework that started piling up and discuss how we can realistically approach it. At this point, I would utilize coaching and skill building so that I can demonstrate how they might realistically tackle this pile of homework. Dr. Ofiesh has taught me a million things, but over and over, she reminds me that we must meet individuals where they are. So in our practice, we're hoping that individuals are learning things that they will use for the lifespan. So if an individual is having significant challenges with their short-term or working memory, my goal is to coach them on how to recognize the challenge and then equip them with the awareness and skills to overcome the challenge. Then, of course, we practice applying those strategies and incorporate specialized tools for support, with the assumption that there is no right or wrong approach, only the approach that works for the individual. This means that if I recommend a tool for my client to try, such as a habit and productivity app like Habitica or Notion, and they come back the next week and tell me they hate both of those apps, that's okay. We're working together to discover what works. And by finding things that don't work, we're getting closer to finding something that does work. Ultimately, individuals are learning resilience as they try and fail and try and succeed with finding routines, tools, and resources that help to reduce their learning challenges. In terms of educational therapy, there was no way that I could support Adam without first understanding what social and emotional factors might be affecting his learning.
So, fast forward to the design thinking process. What Kara is describing is a big part of the design thinking process. She's talking about how she had to suspend the notion that there is this typical learner. Too often, that is just this mythical, there's this mythical average person out there that we think we can not only teach to, but sell to. And I say sell to because the design thinking process actually came out of the business framework and the sales and marketing framework, where individuals, where corporations were trying to think, how can we truly understand who at the time we moved from the word customers to users, how can we understand the user experience? And through my work in inclusion and working with Universal Design at CAST, that was the home of Universal Design for Learning, we started to really understand that the design thinking process is limited because even though it's being anchored in the user experience, and empathy is one of the stages of the design thinking process, it's leaving out everyone at the ends of the spectrum. So again, there still was this assumption that there is this mythical average person out there everywhere, and this one way of teaching or operating or communicating or doing therapy or anything would be okay, that it would fit this average. So I started to work in the schools of medicine and engineering at Stanford in their design thinking classes to help individuals start thinking about neurodiversity and where do neurodiverse people fit in the design thinking process. And it was a remarkable experience because we would be working with these young, brilliant students who are trying to innovate tools to use in medicine, teachers who are trying to think about novel ways of recreating the classroom, not only for the 21st century, but forever and future, and adapt to the way society adapts. And there was still this thinking that there's this one size fits all would work for everyone. So we started to bring in panels of people who were ADHD, had mental health issues, were on the autism spectrum, had dyslexia and anxiety, dyslexia and ADHD, and a whole host, and people who had physical disabilities, and a whole host of individuals who were not necessarily ever a part of anyone's user experience. And from that, we started to think, wow, we are missing so much about how to reach our students in the classroom and how to design and innovate everything, even in the humanistic fields of education and psychology and social work, to meet them where they are and to really hear what their needs are and perspective shift to what are your needs. And over again, this has been such a rewarding experience for me as I see the aha experience of the graduate students in the classroom who completely then redesigned their approach to working with individuals, or whether it be medical technology or an engineering device, etc. So design thinking and empathy is one of the very first stages of design thinking. It ends with prototyping your invention, whether it be a classroom or something else. But it's a foundational element of design thinking where we require educators to really understand and share the feelings of their students and colleagues and other users of the school environment. One interesting example is getting faculty together, a group of adult teachers, and having them map from point A to point B on their phone with a GPS system, and then asking them how they did it and asking them to raise their hand. How many of you used text to speech, speech to text? How many of you used linear directions? How many of you used a three-dimensional map? How many of you used a different form of transportation? And it's remarkable and sometimes amusing to hear colleagues that have worked together for years say, "Really? You do it that way? Oh my gosh, I could never do it that way." And then I always say at the end of this conversation, can you imagine if you were a student in that classroom and your teacher said, "You have to turn in this paper this way"? The thinking process and empathy has really brought us to is appreciating the neurodiversity of the brain and how we need to really appreciate the nuances of how everyone learns.
With empathy, we can't assume a one-size-fits-all approach. It is an interactive process where information is flowing in two directions. That means that empathy is not just about feeling for someone else, but also about receiving and responding. It's a dynamic, reciprocal exchange rather than a one-way act. We believe that if empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, there's necessity for this to be in a cultural context. Across cultures, there's both collective and individualistic empathy, and countries that traditionally have a more collective empathy are more connected to this idea of nurturing empathy. So this happens when individuals see themselves as part of the bigger picture. Maybe they have closer ties to their family and generally prioritize their interpersonal relationships. I'll give you a specific example. After a student in class shares their experience of being bullied, then the entire class, guided by the teacher, could engage in a discussion about empathy, inclusion, and emotional safety. This is collective empathy because the class is sharing an emotional response to one student's story. We can compare this to a more individualistic society where people see themselves as separate from others and are focused on demonstrating their uniqueness, which can make it harder to see the commonalities that all of us share. For example, if a teacher notices that a normally high-performing student is unusually quiet and disengaged in class, they might check in with the student privately. And let's say they learn that the student is dealing with a family issue. The teacher might respond by offering flexibility with deadlines and encouraging the student to take care of themselves. This is individualistic empathy because the teacher's response is attuned to one student's emotional state. With our work, empathy makes all the difference. We think of empathy like a conversation, not a monologue. Just as good communication requires listening and replying thoughtfully, empathy requires both understanding and a meaningful response. Employing empathy allows us to engage with the individual through curiosity and sensitivity. A lot of times my clients will share that they feel comfortable telling me things that they've never expressed or even realized before we started working together. Information about their specific challenges in a class, stress in their friend group, or maybe their perceived stress about a difficult course they're taking next year. They feel comfortable sharing these things with me, not because I'm a magician and can pull a rabbit out of a hat. It connects back to the neuroscience principle of mirroring. As with repetition and predictability, I help to imprint a template for how to recognize, understand, and work through their challenges. You're on mute.
Everyone's favorite expression in the last 5 years. So we've talked a lot about how we came to anchor educational therapy and empathy. But really how this started in a simpler way too is individuals would come to educational therapists over and over again after not having success with a psychologist, not having success for the teacher, not having success with a special educator, and then coming to an educational therapist looking for an answer. Typically, our students are falling through the cracks. They may not be neurodiverse, but they may be at risk for other reasons. One of the things that we have come to really appreciate and learn from neuroscience as educational therapists is that the whole first layer of the brain is emotion. And we believe that there's frequently been limitations to traditional therapies across the board because we try and get right to the problem and solve the problem without recognizing that the whole outer layer of the brain is emotion. And very little can get through to cognition, problem solving, working memory, processing speed, rote sequential memory, linear thinking, until you can get through that layer of emotion. And if someone is struggling, you have to address that layer of emotion before you can address the actual problem that they've come to see. And we don't think about this often as educators because we are not psychological therapists or social workers or mental health providers. But anchoring our work in empathy has allowed us to learn so much about where this individual is, for example, in context. For example, they may be struggling, and then all of a sudden you learn there's a lot of people living in their house, and the internet is unstable, and there's a lot of noise, or there's crying children, or there's violence. There's something going on that no one ever thought about. But by stopping to think about, again, the user experience, empathic questioning, and understanding that you've got to break through this layer of emotion and perspective shift where this individual is coming from, you can make great progress. Culture. Also, too often we project our own culture onto other individuals' cultures. And I'm not just talking about cultures across country, I'm talking about a local culture as opposed to someone across town. And thinking then about cognition and neurodiversity. We know anxiety, depression, ADHD, mental health, that immediately is going to impact working memory and processing speed. So working memory is your brain's hold and perform function. The example I give people all the time is, tell me your phone number, now tell me your phone number backwards. As soon as you say it backwards, now you've kicked in working memory. That's really necessary to learn. But if you've got a student who's laden in emotion and misunderstood and not feeling understood and feeling lost, it's very, very hard to reach their ability to learn and think. And so we've come to really appreciate neuroscience, empathy, the user experience, and how brains differ, and leverage that into educational therapy in a very powerful way.
All right, so I might be an expert on ADHD and dyslexia, but the individuals who I work with are the experts on themselves. So in this way, our work again hinges on a shared balance of power. As the more I know about the individual, their behaviors, their feelings, and the context of how all of this comes together, the more effective I can be with providing support. Earlier, I mentioned that it's a necessary part of the learning and growth process for the individual to try various strategies, tools, and resources, and then for them to tell me when it's not working. But when they tell me that something doesn't work, that's my opportunity to ask them open-ended questions and gain further context. I want them to explain how and why it doesn't work. When they tried the new app, were they focused on it or were they distracted by other things? Were they trying the app early in the morning after they'd just woken up, or was it during the day when they felt more awake? Did they try the app more than once over a couple of days, or was this something that they opened up, looked at, and were immediately uninterested? These questions help to open up the brain to possibilities beyond the binary of yes, it works or no, it doesn't work. Yes, it works, but why? No, it doesn't work, but in what context? If an individual tells me that they spent time studying for a test, but ultimately didn't get the score or result that they wanted, their first instinct is often that they should have spent more time studying. But instead of automatically assuming that more time spent studying will solve the problem, I would ask them about the methods that they used for studying. If they were reading passages in a textbook, were they highlighting and taking notes? If they were watching videos, were they pausing to self-test every 20 minutes or so to make sure they were retaining and learning the information? I want to know, in what ways were they actively engaging with the content? Here's a practical example. I was working with a college student who has ADHD and dyslexia, and she told me she was having a hard time memorizing information for a test. I asked to see what she was doing, and she showed me how she filled in her study guide on the left. You can see that she's answered the questions, but her responses weren't personalized with her own language or with her own style to help the information stick. So I suggested that she tailor her study guide by adding in language that she would use if she was talking to herself, using colors to help make things jump off the page, highlighting in red the things that she didn't know at all, and highlighting in green the things that she could answer every single time without hesitation. These methods support how she processes and retains information and works with her brain instead of against it. Dyslexia can make it hard to process large blocks of text. So highlighting those keywords or ideas helps to break up the page and makes it visually easier to scan and focus on what's important. Color coding can also help create visual cues for the brain, making it easier to remember the related information. So by turning notes into a more digestible and memorable format, it's more likely she will process and retain the information for long-term learning. So in this way, asking these open-ended questions allows us to identify and understand the pressure points and where the individual needs support. In working with gifted individuals, I frequently find that their academic challenges are rooted in social and emotional dysregulation. I hear a lot of stories that start with description of how their homework is being missed and they never have enough time to study, or their essay writing is always being done at the last minute. But then when I dig deeper, I might learn that the individual is working 30 hours a week, or is currently unhoused and sleeping in their car, or being a caretaker for their family in between being a full-time student. I worked with a student this semester who expressed that every time she started to feel stable academically, something negative would happen with her roommates that would send her into a spiral. So we work towards unpacking those challenges by addressing the root issue. If you know you have a problematic roommate, what can we realistically do to anticipate that challenge? I want the mindset to be that the individual is in control, that the individual is on the offensive instead of always reacting defensively and emotionally. To do this, we might proactively plan to study at a cafe or a library or with classmates, alternatives that can exist with or without roommate problems. We can also role play. Role playing and perspective shifting in a stressful situation helps the brain cope with stress by preparing it both mentally and physically. I might ask, what would your response be if you're studying and then your roommate comes home and starts to disturb you? Or I might ask, what would your response be if you get to the library and then you recognize you can't actually focus? What comes next? By talking about potential things that could go wrong, or at least differently from the ideal plan, I'm hoping to help the individual with perspective shifting. Stress often comes from not knowing what will happen. So role playing lets you simulate the situation ahead of time, which gives your brain a sense of control and familiarity and lowers anxiety because the situation doesn't feel so unpredictable. When we practice a response, even in a pretend scenario, it activates the same brain areas involved in real life situations. So for anxious individuals, the power of perspective shifting cannot be overstated. Repeated practice helps to train your brain to respond more calmly and effectively, forming stronger neural connections for handling stress. So when your brain knows you've successfully handled similar situations before, even if they were just in practice, it's more confident and less reactive under the pressure. Once individuals are equipped with other options that can help them feel more in control, then they can start to see the challenges as actually a fundamental part of the problem-solving process.
So, as we start to wind up our presentation, and thank you very much for your comments in the chat. We appreciate those. Let's talk about, we were talking about empathy, we're talking about design thinking, we're talking about educational therapy. And at the end of the day, what we really want is to move the needle for the reasons that an individual was brought to us. So this part of the presentation is really designed to do two things. One, what have we learned to inform our practice as educators through empathy and design thinking, and what works with our students? Very often we find that the first part of the struggle that students and parents have, or adults themselves, because many of our students are adults, and I really meant it when I said through retirement, individuals going back to school who had failed and now they're inspired and they want to go back to school and learn. They're addressing some of the same issues that kept them from going to school to begin with. What we've learned is Sometimes teachers and educators tend to focus on the content. So they think an individual is not succeeding because they haven't actually learned the content, whether it be biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, literature, whatever it is. But we have found that regardless of intelligence, there are many individuals that still are not fluent in the basic skills. They may be reading at an adequate level, but very slowly. Their math, I saw this even with brilliant Stanford students who were doing well in statistics and many other elite universities, doing very sophisticated math, but their basic rote math fact retrieval was very slow. That would then cause them to make simple errors. And so we make these assumptions. Again, what is the beauty of empathy? We have to suspend our assumptions about prerequisite skills, prerequisite knowledge, what we think is there in the face of who is in front of us. Some of these individuals really have not mastered basic skills, but because of their high functioning capability, they've compensated. So we've still got to help them with some tools in those areas. Some might be cognitive strategies. Essentially, a cognitive strategy is how do I approach this task? Very much what Kara has been talking about. What kinds of technology might be helpful? Or what type of collaboration would really, really help this work generalize to every other aspect of this individual's life? Because our work in isolation and in a vacuum will not go very far. We want success to generalize throughout an individual's life experience. And then wise counsel. Sometimes as educators, we have to stop and recognize this is out of my hands as an educator. This person really might need an eye exam, a physical exam. They may need mental health therapy. They may need support through a community center where they can meet individuals who can understand their background, or something out of the scope of traditional support. And this is what we call our multifaceted approach. And we go through these types of what we call our tool buckets when we approach individuals. And with this way, starting with empathy and thinking about all of these different buckets of tools, we feel like we can really cover all the bases. Next slide, please. So final thoughts on the empathy effect from my perspective. Why do I say the 21st and 22nd century? Because one of the most rewarding things that you can hear is from a parent or a spouse or a good friend who says, I finally understand what the issue was with the individual. And it also helped me to understand myself. I even understand my spouse better now. It demystified everything. And that aha experience can change generations of people to come after it. It is truly remarkable how you can help a family or a system to stop, to suspend judgment, to rethink their approach to the interactions with their family, and grow with compassion and empathy, and start to enjoy the question of why did that happen? Not why did you do that? Or why can't you do this? So we know from neuroscience that emotion precedes learning and behavior, and we genuinely believe we have to validate that any struggling learner's perspective is so important in order to allow the part of the brain that allows for problem solving and thinking to flourish. So through innovation in the business world's framework of design thinking, we have been able to successfully address the learning needs of many struggling learners. And I should say, we have been able to teach the business world that they need to broaden the user experience to extend their notion of what is a typical learner and what empathy really means in the design thinking approach.
Yeah. Honestly, the longer I do this work, the more you can really sense how deeply connected everything is. There is no academic profile without a social and emotional profile. There is no long-term success without balancing the immediate social and emotional needs. Many people understand that growing vegetables starts with cultivating healthy soil. And in the same way, empathy is the foundational ingredient for lifelong learning. I don't want to leave you on a cliffhanger, so I'll share that Adam is doing so well. He's had tremendous academic success and will actually start medical school in the fall. But most importantly for me is his social and emotional success. He knows how to work through his own challenges to the extent that he can now help others. And that is the empathy effect.
Thank you. We welcome your questions. We have a few minutes and can still wrap up at the half hour.
Thank you.
There was one question that said, what role does listening play in empathy?
Well, honestly, as I mentioned, it's really a two-way street. So if we aren't incorporating listening, then we're not being empathetic. You know, we can't just be passive. We can't just say, I'm going to talk and you listen, or we can't just say, I'm going to listen while you talk. It has to be continuous. It has to be a two-way street. It has to be conversational. So listening is very much a part of it, because even as you're listening, you're learning. You know, that's the great thing about empathy as well. You don't just max out as an empath. You become more empathetic over time. And the more situations you experience, the more people you surround yourself with, you become a more empathic individual. So listening really is the key for what helps you to continue being a more empathetic individual.
Well said, well said. Thank you for that, Sarah. One more question is, can empathy be learned, or is it something we are born with? Dr. Ofiesh?
That's a wonderful question. And I think it depends on how you define empathy. If you go back to the definitions that Kara generated in the beginning, you might answer that differently. From the design thinking approach, you definitely can learn empathic skills. And related to the question on listening, part of what we teach when we teach individuals how to do design thinking is don't stop with the answer to the questions. Ask another question and ask another question and say, tell me more. How did that make you feel? What do you think? And wait, and pause. So those are skills you can teach. You can teach someone, ask another question. What question should I ask? Give the respondent time to respond and ask them more. Ask for clarification, like the presenters were talking about before us. You know, what does it mean to elaborate? Ask, what does that mean? Is this what I hear you saying? So those kinds of things indeed can be taught. And if you are taking good notes and you genuinely want to incorporate this person's perspective, I think for sure you can teach empathy. Now, whether or not you actually feel empathy, I don't, can you bridge from teaching objective skills and behaviors to understand perspective shifting, to internalize that as empathy? I think, again, it goes back to how you define empathy.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
How early can you start teaching children about this design thinking? and connecting to empathy practice?
Immediately.
I was going to say in utero. That's a good.
Immediately. And it's very easy to find information on the design thinking process. The D School at Stanford has free materials online. Um, and there's a lot of information now on design thinking in education. And it's a brilliant process to help teach students how to design a project. I mean, we've used it in a million different ways, but the steps are really thoughtful, and it's great. And again, it helps young people understand what the world of work will become like also. And I don't think it's ever too early to prepare individuals for adulthood and quote real life. But why not? Why would we not?
Thank you so much for answering.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you.
That was a absolutely fabulous presentation. Thank you for sharing the personal journey of empathy in each individual. I looked at it as you talked about Adam and your other case study. It just showed the depth to which you understood the individual and how looking at an average really doesn't tell you about the human being and what their reality is and what their lived experience is. And talking about the hidden curriculum, that was a really important part where we are not teaching, that we are not addressing in our schools, and yet it plays such a huge part. So thank you so much for bringing your experience, your brilliance, both of you, and talking to us about your process, about your strategies. And I think that we will all come back to this lecture and look at those slides and see, hey, which part of this resonates with me? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.